Hello everyone, welcome to AMH 2020, U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877. In this video we're going to discuss American foreign policy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This period is often referred to as the era of American imperialism. We're going to begin by defining America as an empire, explaining what an empire is and what it is not, and how the idea of empire has changed over time. We'll discuss the closing of the frontier, the U.S.'s final conquest and integration of the American West, and some earlier attempts that the U.S. makes to build a overseas empire, because America is building an empire on the North American continent before it is beginning to extend its power and its hegemony beyond its land-based borders. We'll talk about things like the purchase of Alaska, the annexation of Hawaii, and then we'll talk about the Spanish-American War, which was a major turning point in U.S. foreign policy. America is now definitely going to be a country that is going to flex its political muscles, flex its hard power and its soft power as well, beyond its established borders, and is going to establish territories overseas, but is also going to try to intervene in other countries, particularly in the Caribbean and in Latin America. We'll talk about the annexation of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and also Guam during the Spanish-American War. We'll discuss why, for example, Puerto Rico is still a territory as of 2025, and we'll talk about America's transition into a world power. America at the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the 1800s, was a relatively weak country that had very little influence outside of North America, but by the beginning of the 1900s, America is a true world power, one that is capable of competing with the old empires of Europe, and in many cases is really beginning to surpass them. And we'll talk about what that means for U.S. foreign policy doctrine, things like the Roosevelt Corollary. I'll explain what that is. I'll talk a bit about foreign policy domestically, which U.S. presidents are driving American foreign policy, how really the foreign policy of this period, it's inextricably linked to the Progressive Era. And we'll talk about some of the U.S. interventions as well in the Caribbean and in Latin America. There are some important trends across all of these interventions, but there also are some differences in why the U.S. intervenes in which specific countries. Specifically, we're going to talk quite a bit about the U.S. interventions in Mexico, because those interventions, they take place on the backdrop not only of the prevailing ideas of U.S. foreign policy, but also on the First World War, which begins in 1914. And the images on this slide, or the image on this slide, is of some very famous military officers from the period. On the far right, you'll see Teddy Roosevelt of the U.S. Volunteers, a politician who led troops during the Spanish-American War. In the center is U.S. Army Regular Officer Leonard Wood, who often disagreed with Teddy Roosevelt. Wood was a career Army officer, a regular, whereas Roosevelt was someone who had National Guard experience and then served in the Spanish-American War. And on the left-hand side is General Joseph Wheeler, a former Confederate actually, who took part in the Spanish-American War. And there was an attempt to recruit Southerners in the Spanish-American War for a variety of reasons, but Wheeler was a former Confederate, and there was a push to get Southerners to support this war, in some cases by giving very elderly former Confederate officers positions in the U.S. military. And it was reported that during the Spanish-American War, Wheeler was charging a Spanish position, and he shouted to his troops, "Get those damn Yankees," which is ironic because he's leading the U.S. Army. And also it's ironic because in Latin America, Yankees or Yankees is a common term for anyone from the United States, not just people from the Northeast. And these three men, I think, really encapsulate the foreign policy values of the period. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive and a politician who served for a short period of time during the Spanish-American War. Wood was a career Army officer that was very interested in modernizing the U.S. military, and then Wheeler was a former Confederate and a Southerner, and there was a push to reconcile the North and the South during this period in order to promote American military strength and also to allow America to better project power as a unified nation. We have to be unified internally if we're going to do anything successfully externally. To begin, I want to talk about the United States as an empire. I'll begin by giving you a definition of an empire. An empire is an extensive, organized group of states, countries, and provinces with different groups of people, ruled by a single government, which really seeks to inculcate a common culture amongst its disparate people. So it's a multi-ethnic country or state spread over a large territory, and there has to be a common government and a common culture. There's many empires throughout world history. There's a couple of examples. Famous empires, the Roman Empire, an empire that Americans would have been aware of and would have had a level of respect for, and the British Empire as well. The British being former enemies of the United States. We broke away from the British Empire during the Revolutionary War, fought them again in the War of 1812. But at the same time, an empire that we looked up to because we shared many common cultural elements. And the term empire today generally has negative connotations. Left-leaning people often condemn the imperialism of the British Empire or even of America. Right-leaning people, they condemned the Soviet Union as the evil empire. That was language used by former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. So it's generally a more negative term today, but it wasn't always a negative term. The Founding Fathers, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, they envisioned America becoming an empire. And they envisioned America as an empire of liberty, or an empire for liberty. That was the language used by the Founding Fathers, particularly by Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. They thought that America would spread the values of freedom and liberty, and it would be a shining light, a city on a hill for the peoples of the world. Again, the idea that America is unique, America is exceptional. American exceptionalism is an old idea in American history. And Americans in the turn of the century period would have had a similar idea to the Founding Fathers in this regard. Not all, but many Americans would have had this idea of empire for liberty. In some ways, America has always been an empire. The 13 colonies that eventually became the 13 states of the United States, they spread across a large expanse of territory, going all the way to the Mississippi River on this map. They have large populations, and they each have different cultures. The culture in Georgia is very different than the culture in New York or the culture in Massachusetts. So it's a large collection of peoples, multi-ethnic groups with a common culture centered around the English language, centered around their commitment to American civic culture. And in many ways, America really is an empire. It's not a very large empire, but it is an empire, I would argue, from the beginning. And America is going to expand its empire westward with territories that will eventually become states. What perhaps might make the American empire different than, say, the British Empire or some of the older empires in Europe and other parts of the world is the pathways for citizenship that are established for people living in the United States. There's ways that one could become a U.S. citizen. Some would argue those ways are not very equitable, but there are also paths for territories to eventually become states as well once they have 60,000 citizen residents or residents who are capable of becoming citizens. So in some ways, the Founding Fathers' prediction that America would be an empire of liberty is true in many ways. This is the United States in about 1889, 1890. This is right around the time that the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier was closed because there are now at least 2 people per square mile. As you can see, not all of the 48 continental United States have come into the Union yet. They are still in the process of doing so, and you'll see them as territories in yellow on this map, including the District of Alaska, the Territory of Alaska, which technically is part of America's overseas empire, because you can't get to Alaska just driving over land unless you're going to leave the United States and enter Canada. It's not part of the contiguous 48 continental United States. It is on the North American continent. We have to leave the U.S. Before you re-enter in Alaska. And the ideas of American freedom and American liberty, they offer freedom and liberty to many people, but in many cases the freedoms and liberties of other cultures and people groups are being seriously curtailed by American territorial growth, American expansion, and American integration. Without making things too complicated, I will say that there were some attempts to create an American empire, or even American colonies as well, outside of the United States' continental reaches. And the first one that's really significant is Liberia. And Liberia was a territory in West Africa that was colonized by African Americans in 1822. These were former slaves who left the United States to have freedom in Africa and to create a African society, or an African American society in Africa. Early abolitionists, especially white abolitionists, and some African American abolitionists believed that colonization was the best route for African Americans, that they would have the best liberty and the best freedom if they left the United States once they had been manumitted from slavery. And the idea was they should return to Africa, even though by this point the United States has been out of the African slave trade for officially they've been out since 1808, so many of these African people were born in the United States. Africa is a very different place, a foreign place, but they're going to go back there in 1822. Liberia will declare independence in 1847, and it will be recognized by the United States as an independent nation by 1862. So it's not in the American empire for very long. There are reports that the black American elite in Liberia, that they often mistreated the indigenous Africans whom they looked down upon. And as time goes on, though, more African American expats, African Americans leaving the United States for a variety of reasons that we've discussed before, they're going to go to Liberia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is part of the Back to Africa movement, supported by people like Marcus Garvey. Garvey was Jamaican, but his ideas were very popular with African Americans. And the U.S. is going to intervene in Liberian politics in the early 20th century, as they're going to in Latin American and Caribbean politics. But aside from these interventions in Liberia, the United States does not participate in the scramble for Africa at the turn of the century the way the European empires do. We're much more focused on things in Latin America and the Caribbean and parts of the Pacific as well. And here is an image of the Liberian cabinet from about the 1880s. They're wearing Western Americanized garb, not traditional African clothing. And here is a photograph of African American people leaving the United States in the 1890s, bound for Liberia. So now we'll discuss the U.S. acquisition or purchase of Alaska. Why did the U.S. buy Alaska? How did this take place, and how did everyday Americans respond to this? The United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. They purchased it for about $7.2 million. But some Americans, they thought the territory was not going to be useful. They thought that it was a bad deal. They thought it was corrupt. Sometimes the deal is called Seward's Folly because it was brokered primarily by this guy, William H. Seward, Secretary of State to Andrew Johnson, shown here. He also was Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. But it's called Seward's Folly. Sometimes it's called the Dark Deal, done in the night, because it was seen as a corrupt deal. But I want to dispel some of those commonly held beliefs about the Alaska Purchase. Many people think in the United States that it was an unpopular purchase. Most Americans thought it was a waste of money. That's not really true from what we found. That charge actually comes from William Seward's political opponents, most notably the very famous Chicago newspaper man Horace Greeley. Greeley was an enemy of Seward and of the kind of mainstream Republican Party during the period, and of course he's going to cover the Alaska Purchase very negatively. There's reasons, though, why Seward wanted to buy Alaska. Its strategic location in the northernmost part of North America could potentially set the United States up for a possible annexation of Canada. The territory before the United States was ruled by Russia. Russia was looking to you could say, divest from the region. Russia needed money in the 1860s. They had fought the very disastrous Crimean War in the 1850s against several countries, but especially against Great Britain. And for the Russians, it was better to sell Alaska to the United States than to have it taken by Great Britain. And really, there actually have been attempts to even to buy Alaska before the Civil War, but the Civil War slows things down. But Seward was an avid American expansionist. He wanted to expand northward. He was very interested in Canadian annexation as well. So for Seward, purchasing Alaska could lead to a future annexation of Canada. And even during the Civil War, Seward had this idea. He thought that if the Union invaded Canada, which belonged to the British, this could motivate the Confederacy to come back into the Union, and the South and the North could unite together to fight against an old enemy, the British, and expand the American land-based empire into Canada. So really, in actuality, Americans supported the purchase. They saw it as a good deal. It was $7.2 million, a good deal by the acre. Of course, it's not as simple as just buying land. There are indigenous Alaskans who live in Alaska, like the Inuit people, for example. There are Native Americans that live in Alaska as well. And there are Russian people that live in Alaska. And we'll talk a bit more about their experiences in a moment. But this map shows some of the checks that were used to purchase the territory. There's a cartoon that shows the Russian Tsar making off with $7 million. And this is actually the size of Alaska compared to the continental United States. It always looks a lot bigger because you're looking at 2D maps versus at the globe, which make the far northern hemisphere look a lot larger than it actually is. And this is a map of Alaska with the Alaskan gold fields. Originally, the primary industry in Alaska was related to the fur trade, the seal fur trade, and initially it had been profitable for the Russians, but over time, as the seal populations were hunted nearly to extinction, the return on investment for holding on to Alaska was getting lower and lower for the Russians, and the Russians had difficulties with the indigenous populations of Alaska as well. There are Native Americans in the southernmost parts of Alaska, but there are also indigenous Alaskans of the Inuit people. Some of these indigenous Alaskans, they used to be called Eskimos, but this term has fallen out of favor in recent years because it's an exonym. It's not a term that indigenous Alaskans would use to describe themselves. It was a term that later Europeans used to describe these people as a single group. So generally, you would refer to them as indigenous Alaskans, and you might identify what cultural group they're part of, like the Inuit, for example. As I said, there are about 8,000 Native Americans in the southern part of Alaska, about 50,000 indigenous Alaskans in this northern region and in the islands, and there were about 2,500 Russian or people of mixed race ancestry, Russian and either Native American or Russian and indigenous Alaskan people, and they're typically called Alaska Creoles. Because of their mixed race heritage. Some people don't like the term Creole, using it to describe people of mixed race, but this was a term that would have been used in the period. And many of the Russians left Alaska once the United States took over. And the indigenous peoples of Alaska, They were often mistreated by the Russians, but they really didn't have any reason to hope for much more from the United States. They certainly could have found out about the U.S.'s policies towards Native Americans in the lower 48. They weren't 48 states yet, but down in the continental United States. But really, initially there was not a lot of white American and non-indigenous American settlement into Alaska. You don't start to see non-indigenous Americans going into Alaska in large numbers until the late 1890s when gold is discovered. Gold was discovered in Nome, Alaska in 1898, and Alaska gold was also discovered across the border in Canada as well at about the same time. So in the late 1890s, you see a gold rush in Alaska. And indigenous Alaskans have faced a lot of the same challenges with the U.S. government, with land use and settlement and things of that nature. And while some scholars might disagree, I think that Alaska was a good purchase for the United States. I'm aware that it is a net receiver of U.S. tax dollars. People living in Alaska are paid thousands of dollars by the U.S. government just to live there because it's a very harsh place to live with its cold weather, its long winters, its long nights, and its relative lack of infrastructure compared to the lower 48. But it's a very strategic location. The Aleutian Islands here, they will allow for coaling stations and stopovers for U.S. ships heading to parts of northern Asia. And of course, the gold and oil that are brought in from Alaska are very lucrative and good for the American economy. So the American economy is going to grow because of having Alaska in the Union, and then it's a very important military outpost as well and trading outpost. So I would argue that it's a net positive for the United States. And Alaska becomes a state in 1959. Here are a couple other small but strategically significant territorial acquisitions the United States was making at about the same time as the Alaska Purchase. And this is Midway Island, which the United States actually explored it in 1859. A sailor named N.C. Brooks explored it. There were no inhabitants, no human inhabitants. It was initially annexed for what was called the guano mining business. And guano is a fancy word for bird droppings, which make a spectacular fertilizer. But as time goes on, as the United States begins to trade more with Asia, and as the United States is building up more of a naval system, islands like Midway are important coaling stations where ships will stop and drop coal, and then naval vessels will stop and take on coal, which is necessary that way they can sail all the way across the Pacific Ocean. And then in World War II, it became a very important airstrip, site of the Battle of Midway, a really, really important battle in the Second World War, which we'll talk about in a future video. There were also some diplomatic foreign policy failures during this period as well. One such failure was the U.S. annexation of Santo Domingo, or the Dominican Republic. The United States had long had an interest in expanding territorially in the Caribbean. In 1854, there was an attempt to purchase Cuba from Spain in something called the Ostend Manifesto. Ostend. It's named after a city in Belgium. After the Civil War, there were still attempts to gain Caribbean territory. Before the Civil War, a lot of those territorial expansions in the Caribbean were often driven by pro-slavery interests that wanted to add future slave states to the Union to gain more congressional representation and just to have more room for slavery. But after the Civil War, there was an attempt to annex the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo. That way African Americans would have a place to go and be safe from what was happening to them in the South. This is something that President Grant was interested in. At the same time, we were also concerned that Haiti, to the west on the island of Hispaniola, or another European empire like Spain, might try to seize control of Santo Domingo, because this had once been a Spanish territory. So we want to keep other countries from expanding into this area, and we're also looking for a safe haven for African Americans, because the Dominican Republic is a black majority country. And there also was hope that if we took over Santo Domingo, it could lead to Cuba and Brazil abolishing slavery as well. Further U.S. emphasis in the region might lead to slavery abolition because the U.S. had abolished slavery during the Civil War. And some African Americans, like Frederick Douglass, they support annexation. The idea is it's Liberia 2.0, but closer. However, most white Americans oppose annexation. They did not want to bring more non-white people into the United States because the question of what would happen to the people of Santo Domingo. Would they become U.S. citizens? Would they eventually gain the right to vote in line with the 13th, 14th, and eventually the 15th Amendment? In the end, this plan fails, and the Grant administration had a lot of problems with corruption, and it was seen as a corrupt act that the white American society rejected. In the 1890s, the U.S. Pursued the annexation of Hawaii, and this was a successful annexation. At least it was successful for the United States. Hawaii had a large white, English, and American, and just European population who had, over many years, acculturated much of the indigenous Hawaiian population. And then they actually led a coup against the indigenous Hawaiian government, its monarch, in 1893. This was a somewhat more controversial annexation because there were Americans who were concerned that if Hawaii was taken into the Union, then non-white people living in Hawaii might become U.S. citizens. Similar concerns have been expressed, racist concerns have been expressed about the failed Dominican Republic Santo Domingo annexation back in the 1870s. As time goes on, though, Hawaii's economic value, its strategic value in the Pacific Ocean, it leads more and more Americans to accept the annexation of Hawaii. There's economic and military interest at play in this Hawaiian annexation, even if the Hawaiian people's rights were violated in the annexation. The U.S. military, especially the Navy, wanted to use Hawaii as a coaling station and as a naval base. They wanted to continue to lease the base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, and this imperialism was certainly motivated by certain racist impulses, the belief that the non-white people of Hawaii did not have a right to self-determination, and that their concerns could be overridden by the United States. But anti-imperialism could also have racist impulses as well, as anti-imperialists feared that as the United States grew its empire overseas and brought in people of color, that these people of color would have to be given civil rights, and that was something they opposed. Hawaii was annexed July 7th, 1898, with the Newlands Resolution. And this cartoon here from Puck magazine, a very famous satirical magazine, it shows President William McKinley, a supporter of Hawaiian annexation, as a preacher leading a shotgun wedding, while he's assisted by John T. Morgan, a former Confederate general who had interests in the U.S. military in the 1890s. Again, reconciliation between the North and the South is taking place. And here we see Uncle Sam and an indigenous Hawaiian woman represented in a rather stereotypical manner being forced to get married. The caption on the image is, "Another shotgun wedding with neither party willing." As I said, though, Americans over time came to support Hawaiian annexation because of the economic and military values that the island chain offered. I want to step back a bit and talk a bit more about Hawaiian history because I think it's very interesting. It's an area of personal interest for me as well. So, as far as we know, the first European contact with the Hawaiian Islands was established in the year 1778 during the voyages of Captain James Cook. Captain Cook was a British explorer who was circumnavigating the globe. He explored Australia, for example, and then made the long voyage from Australia all the way to Hawaii. Some people think that perhaps the Spanish may have explored Hawaii earlier, but we don't have as good of documentary evidence to back that up. So we'll go with the general consensus that Captain Cook of the British, his exploratory mission, that was the first European contact with the Hawaiian Islands. And there was an interesting interaction between Captain Cook and the indigenous Hawaiian people. At first, they thought that Captain Cook might possibly be a god because of the sailing ships and the technology that he and his crew had. They offered Captain Cook and his crew food, water, supplies, things they needed very badly after a long journey across the Pacific Ocean. The crew of Captain Cook's vessel took the food and supplies. In exchange, the indigenous Hawaiians, having given the English, shared food and things with them, they began to take things from the British ships, tools and especially nails, which they wanted to use as a building material. And for the Hawaiians, the indigenous Hawaiians, they had more of a share and share alike culture that you could give and take freely as long as what you were taking was not under what was called kapu, Kapu, which is sort of like a curse, but it means you can't take it. But the British became very upset. They felt the Hawaiians were stealing from them, even though the Hawaiians had helped them, and their ships began to fall apart because all the nails are taken out. It's actually kind of comical, this cultural exchange, but relations get more tense as well. And there's a standoff between Captain Cook and the Hawaiians, and the Hawaiians have begun to doubt that the captain was this divine figure. They called him a haole, Haole, which it's generally a kind of a pejorative term for a foreign person or a non-Hawaiian person. But originally it meant someone who didn't know their family history, and they asked Captain Cook to recite his family history. He could only name it back a couple of generations, and for the Hawaiians, knowing your family history, that was very important. It was how you introduced yourself, how you showed that you were someone of importance, and there was a fight. The captain was wounded, and they quickly realized he is not a god, he is not invincible, and he was killed. At the same time, though, they still thought that he was a man of power. Mana, they call it, Mana in the Hawaiian language. And what the Hawaiians did was they took Captain Cook's body, they put it into an oven, and they burned off the flesh, and they sent some of the charred bones back to Captain Cook's crew. You might say that Captain Cook was cooked. Now, the British, when they received these charred bones, they were stunned and frightened. They thought that these barbarous Hawaiians had eaten their captain. This led to the rumor and the myth that the Hawaiians practiced cannibalism, which, from what I've seen, they did not practice cannibalism, or at least if they did, it was a very, very long period in their past. They weren't doing so by the 18th century. But it's a kind of rumor that would be spread around in the United States for many years to come. And other Pacific Islands or Polynesian cultures did practice cannibalism. What the Hawaiians really were doing was they were trying to keep some of Captain Cook's mana, his power, and they were actually trying to send some of his mana back to the British, kind of to try to honor the British in a way and honor Captain Cook's memory. It seems very odd to us, but to the Hawaiians this was a rather commonplace thing. But either way, Captain Cook's crew were not happy about it. So in 1795, King Kamehameha I, seen here on this slide on the right-hand side in European garb, and here's a statue of him in traditional Hawaiian clothing. He united the Hawaiian archipelago, the Hawaiian Islands, into a single kingdom. Previously, they'd been ruled by multiple different rulers, but Kamehameha I united them into one island nation, you could say, and he ruled as an absolute monarch. And his dynasty is going to rule until 1872. And as time goes on, Hawaii becomes a very important and popular stopping over place and resupplying place for European and eventually American vessels. Whaling ships in particular will stop in Hawaii to resupply, to buy and sell things, to spend time with the Hawaiian people, particularly male sailors spending time with Hawaiian women. Unfortunately, as time goes on, sexually transmitted illnesses spread across the Hawaiian population. These are absolutely devastating to the Hawaiian people. Diseases like tuberculosis, which are spread from livestock to people, also begin to spread, and the Hawaiian population is going to be really decimated by these diseases spreading, similar to what happened to Native Americans in the United States, the 48 United States. It's estimated that there were about 400,000 Hawaiians at the time of first European contact. By the time that Hawaii is becoming a part of the United States, there are perhaps 40,000 indigenous Hawaiians left. So a massive casualty event caused by disease and caused by other types of exploitation that I'm going to go over soon. In 1819, American Protestant missionaries arrive in the Hawaiian Islands, and their plan was to convert the Hawaiian people to Christianity. The Hawaiians practiced a polytheistic religion, and they hoped to replace that polytheistic religion with Christianity. And the missionaries believed that they were there to benefit the Hawaiian people. They thought that they could protect the Hawaiian people from the corrupting influence of sailors and whalers, and to keep them they tried to keep them separate from the sailors and the whalers, which may have actually not been that bad of an idea, considering where some of these sexually transmitted illnesses would have been coming from. But they're also going to enact a series of what are called blue laws that are going to intentionally target many elements of traditional Hawaiian culture. The polytheistic religion, liquor and drug consumption are going to be banned as well. They're going to try to keep sailors from supplying Hawaiians with liquor. They're going to ban things like prostitution or sex work, and they're also going to ban things like gambling, boxing, hula dancing, and technically, they're not going to ban things like surfing, but they're going to heavily discourage many traditional Hawaiian cultural elements. The idea is they want the Hawaiian people to be hardworking, to establish farms for themselves, and to practice a very regimented form of Christianity, and to kind of keep as separated as possible from those rowdy sailors. And many Hawaiians do become Christian, and many of them do begin to have relationships with the Hawaiian missionaries over time as well. The missionaries are not able to dissolve Hawaiian culture entirely. Rather, what happens is Hawaiian culture changes. You see cultural syncretism, a mixing of European and indigenous Hawaiian cultures and pastimes. Sports like surfing don't go away entirely, but they do become discouraged. The idea is you ought to not be in the ocean surfing, having leisure activities, particularly leisure activities where you're in the nude. You should be working in the field, building a farm for yourself instead. Henry Augustus Wise, this guy here, he was a U.S. naval officer who spent some time in Hawaii because it was an important naval resupply site. He actually was gambling with some Hawaiians, which gambling was against those blue laws. But then he asked the Hawaiians to take him surfing, and they took him out surfing, and he said that it was very difficult. He felt like he swallowed the whole ocean, that he nearly drowned. But surfing is going to, unfortunately, become less popular over time, and it's going to be rebuilt as a cultural pastime in Hawaii. Around the turn of the century, around the 1910s, there's going to be renewed interest in surfing amongst indigenous Hawaiians, and also some non-indigenous people in Hawaii are going to write about surfing and even try it for themselves. But activities like boxing, they often were tied to gambling as well. You would bet on the winners, and the missionaries wanted to stop gambling, and they wanted to stop boxing as well because it was violent, and it was they thought a waste of time, and it was tied to gambling. But here are some Hawaiian hula dancers, and they've traded out their grass skirts made of local organic materials, and instead they're wearing calico textile skirts. So it's cultural syncretism between the missionaries and between the indigenous Hawaiians. As time goes on, the missionaries' control of Hawaii begins to decline. It begins to wane, and a new class of non-indigenous people begin to take over. And this is the planter class. And these are European and American investors who purchase land in the Hawaiian Islands, and they're going to grow a variety of crops. They're going to grow things like sugarcane. They're going to grow things like pineapples. Pineapples are actually not native to Hawaii. They're native to South America, but they grow very well in the volcanic soil of Hawaii. It's a great place to practice agriculture. They're also going to grow things like sandalwood, and they're going to grow macadamia nuts as well. Although macadamias were originally brought in to be they were brought in to really be a windbreak around fields, but they also produce a really delicious nut as well. So the planter elite over time, they want to take more and more control over Hawaiian politics and Hawaiian culture and society. They also bring in a new group of non-indigenous working people to work basically as indentured servants on their plantations. And these are Asian workers, especially from China. Because remember, the indigenous Hawaiian population has been decimated by disease. The planters want a new labor force. And this is happening in the 1870s. And at this point, the planter class of Hawaii, even those that are of American ancestry, they don't really want to be part of the United States at this point. And this is going to continue into the 1880s as well. And this is primarily because Hawaii had what was called a Treaty of Reciprocity with the United States. They were able to sell their agricultural products, especially sugarcane, without having to pay tariffs in the United States. And then they could have American manufactured goods, made in American factories, brought into Hawaii because Hawaii doesn't have that industrial capacity. So it's a really great kind of sweetheart deal for, particularly for the planter class of Hawaii. Joining the United States in the 1880s, that would have meant that Hawaii would have been under the Chinese Exclusion Act, and they would no longer be able to bring in these Chinese, basically they were indentured servant workers. Their passage would be paid for, and they would work until the debt was paid off. They would no longer be able to bring in Chinese workers. Also, this labor arrangement is a form of, really, you might argue it's a form of temporary slavery, and thus is illegal under the 13th Amendment. So in the 1870s, 1880s, the early 1880s, they're not going to want to be part of the United States, but things are going to change. By the 1870s, the Hawaiian monarchy had begun to disintegrate, as the monarchs of the Kamehameha dynasty struggled to produce male heirs and had to begin elections to choose the next ruler of the country. King David Kalakaua was elected in 1874. He was elected on an agenda of Hawaii for Hawaiians and trying to reintroduce elements of Hawaiian culture that had been previously suppressed by the missionaries. And Kalakaua was a patron of the arts. He was very interested in traditional Hawaiian culture and even in bringing in new elements into Hawaiian culture, namely the ukulele, for example. And he was called the Merry Monarch because of his jovial personality and his interest in arts and performance and in hosting parties and events and things like that. In 1875, he's actually going to be the one who's going to negotiate the Treaty of Reciprocity discussed previously. In the Treaty of Reciprocity, it gave Hawaii a sort of a sweetheart deal with the United States where they could sell sugar in the U.S. without tariffs. Other countries had to pay tariffs, and then they could import manufactured goods from the United States. And the U.S. also used this treaty as a way to establish a naval base at Pearl Harbor. So both countries benefit from this deal. Kalakaua also toured the world. He circumnavigated the globe, visiting countries, making trade arrangements, and particularly contract, or what you might call indentured servitude labor agreements with countries, encouraging foreign workers to come in to work on the plantations of Hawaii. But all of these actions, they are expensive. There are allegations of corruption and spending too much money. And the white planter elite class senses weakness from Kalakaua. And in 1887, they're going to basically force him to sign what is called the Bayonet Constitution, because this was a document that he signed essentially under threat of violence. And the 1887 Constitution drastically limited the power of the Hawaiian monarch. Traditionally, Hawaiian monarchs had ruled, Hawaiian kings had ruled more like absolute monarchs, like what you might have seen in 17th century France. But this Bayonet Constitution turned Hawaii into a constitutional monarchy that, in which the monarch had very little power. The monarch's ability to appoint cabinet members was greatly diminished, and the power of the Hawaiian Parliament, which was dominated by the planter class, the people of European and Anglo-American ancestry, their power increased significantly. In addition, the Bayonet Constitution included provisions that would install property requirements to vote. Also, you had to not owe any tax debt to vote, and these property and debt requirements would have effectively disenfranchised most of the non-white population of Hawaii who could not afford to have the right to vote. In addition, the Bayonet Constitution also it forbade Asian people, naturalized Asian people, from voting. Indigenous Hawaiians and Europeans and Americans, people of American and European descent, could still vote as long as they met the property requirements. But the indigenous Hawaiians largely would have been disenfranchised by the property requirements. There also are interpretations of the Constitution that essentially would have allowed non-citizen people, if they're of European or American descent, not Asian descent, to vote as well if they could meet the property requirements. But constitutions are always being interpreted and reinterpreted. Either way, the Bayonet Constitution was signed under duress, and it drastically limited the power of the Hawaiian monarch. In 1890, the Treaty of Reciprocity comes to an end with the McKinley Treaty. It's named after U.S. Congress member William McKinley, future President William McKinley, and the no tariff situation that Hawaii has with the United States comes to an end. Hawaii will now have to compete with other countries selling sugar and agricultural products in the United States. In addition, there's the prospect that even Hawaiian sugar could be tariffed in the future, and this leads to a economic recession in Hawaii, and in part will inspire Kalakaua to essentially abdicate the throne. He leaves Hawaii and actually sails to California. He also was dealing with some very serious problems by this point in his life, and he was unable to produce a male heir, and so he left his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, to be the next ruler, the next monarch of Hawaii. And Liliuokalani will try to restore the power of the Hawaiian monarch. She will try to undo the Bayonet Constitution. There were also rumors that she was interested in legalizing gambling for the purpose of raising revenue for the Hawaiian government, and even possibly in legalizing opium drugs. But again, some of these accounts, they come from people that were opposed to the queen and were looking for reasons to remove her from power. So she comes to power in 1891, and in 1893, the white planter class, they will lead a coup against the Queen of Hawaii, and the planter class, they had formed themselves into militias. Sometimes they're called rifle clubs, and as a group, they're collectively referred to as the revolutionists, because they were leading a revolution against the monarch of the country of Hawaii. They were facing off against the royalists, who were a predominantly indigenous Hawaiian group who were supporting their monarch and were supporting their traditional mode of governance. And the revolutionist militias were successful in overthrowing the monarchy and capturing the Queen. After they had captured the Queen, U.S. Minister to Hawaii John Stevens requested sailors and Marines from the USS Boston that they disembark and enter Honolulu. Allegedly, they were there occupying the city to protect American expats living in the city and American property in the city as well. Although by this point the revolutionists had taken control of the city, so by being there they were essentially going to stop any royalists from potentially counterattacking and trying to retake control of the Hawaiian government. So the United States, in doing so, the U.S. minister had brought the U.S. officially into this coup against the Hawaiian monarchy, although there is some debate about what exactly the intentions of the minister were. If it was simply to protect American citizens and property, or if they were really trying to help the revolutionists. In response to the coup against her, Queen Liliuokalani petitions the U.S. government, particularly President Grover Cleveland, asking for assistance in regaining the throne of the country, since Americans, the American minister, and then there had been Americans involved directly in the coup as well, to help her retake the throne. And President Cleveland initially was very sympathetic to the Queen. The president was an anti-imperialist and generally imperialism was something he regarded as being too big government. President Cleveland opposed that sort of thing, and he ordered a report be done by James Blount called the Blount Report. As time went on, though, the Queen said that not only did she want to regain the throne of Hawaii, but she wanted to have the revolutionist conspirators executed and have their property seized. And that was too much for President Cleveland, who wanted to ensure that the revolutionists received clemency for their actions. Remember, this is the 1890s. It's about 30 years after the American Civil War. The United States showed a lot of clemency towards former Confederates, and Cleveland wanted to see something similarly done in the event of the Queen retaking control of the country. And after she made those pronouncements, the President Cleveland said that this was not an issue that was up to him as the president, it was up to Congress. And Congress was much less sympathetic to the Queen. They commissioned their own report called the Morgan Report, named after John Morgan, who was a supporter of U.S. annexation to Hawaii, and they didn't find the kind of wrongdoing that the Blount Report did. In the end, though, the Hawaiian monarchy was disestablished, and 5 years later, in 1898, the United States will annex Hawaii in the Newlands Resolution. This allows the planters to now trade with the United States as a territory and not have to worry about tariffs. And Hawaii will become a state in 1959, the same year Alaska became a state. And one of the principal leaders of this coup was a man named Sanford Dole. His his relative, James Dole, will actually go on to found the Dole Fruit Company. It's well known in the United States today, although the fruit company was founded after the coup in 1895. In 1993, on the 100th anniversary of the coup against the Queen, the U.S. government under President Bill Clinton ran a new report about the United States' involvement, officially and unofficially, in the coup, and the president issued an apology to the Hawaiian people for the role that Americans played in this coup against their government, and then for annexing their country without a proper vote amongst the Hawaiian people. This is the USS Boston, 1884. It's a steel hull cruiser, steam and sail powered, and it was sailors and Marines from this vessel that disembarked and deployed in Honolulu in 1893. Officially, they were there to protect American lives and property, but by deploying there at that point in the Hawaiian insurrection, they were essentially backing the revolutionists and supporting their coup against the Hawaiian Queen. And this could be considered an instance of gunboat diplomacy, the United States using its navy to intervene and have influence over the affairs of another country. And the United States will use gunboat diplomacy many times in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is a very famous cartoon from Puck magazine. It's from 1899, so it's from after the Hawaiian annexation, but it shows Uncle Sam as a very strict teacher. He's trying to teach the non-white people of the world who are being brought into the American Empire, either officially, like Hawaii, like Puerto Rico as well, like the Philippines, and Cuba, which officially was independent, but the U.S. will intervene in Cuba. He is teaching them very strictly to be good students, to essentially act like white students. And here you see Alaska in the back is portrayed as a person of color, as a woman of color, but she is, reading and studying quietly alongside all of the other white students who represent states, like Texas, for example. Here you see a Native American student in the corner who's struggling. The book is held upside down, and there's a Chinese student coming into the school, suggesting that perhaps China will someday be part of the American Empire as well. We'll get to China a little bit later in this video, and then meanwhile, an African American student looks on, portrayed in, again, a racially stereotypical, casually racist manner. He's not allowed to participate in school. Instead, he's just there to essentially be a janitor. And Puck magazine, sometimes its cartoons supported imperialism, sometimes they didn't. The caption on this cartoon actually says, Uncle Sam to his new class of civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while you will feel as glad to be here as they are. It's, a very cynical caption, a rather sarcastic caption. And then if you look even closer, it's a little bit hard to read, but on the blackboard it says, the consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented to or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The U.S. must govern its new territories with or without the consent until they can govern themselves. And then in the back, there's a poster that says the Confederated States, the CSA, refused their consent to be governed, but the Union was preserved without their consent. So it's an anti-imperialist cartoon. It's critical of U.S. foreign policy. It's also, in an odd way, kind of a somewhat pro-Confederate cartoon as well. Sometimes Puck magazine had some pro-Confederate cartoons in its criticism of the U.S. government. There were anti-imperialist Confederates. The author of the Blount Report, that was the report that investigated the U.S. government's involvement in the Hawaiian coup. He was a former Confederate. And then at the same time, there were pro-imperialist Confederates as well. One of the biggest supporters of Hawaiian annexation was J.T. Morgan, a former Confederate military officer. So just as there are imperialist and anti-imperialist Americans, there are even pro-Confederates in American politics who are both pro and anti-imperialism. And now we'll come to the Spanish-American War, which in historical scholarship in the past has been seen as a major turning point in U.S. foreign policy and diplomatic history. And it is a very significant event. It was called the Splendid Little War by John Hay, an American politician. It was not called that by Teddy Roosevelt, although Roosevelt would have agreed with Hay's sentiment. But it's seen this way because it was a successful military victory for the United States, really a resounding military victory. And after the war, the United States' territorial presence, its both hard and soft power across the world, not only in the Caribbean and Latin America, but in the Pacific as well, really increased. Although if you've been paying attention in this video, you'll know that America was increasing its power across the world before the 1898 Spanish-American War, but things are really going to accelerate in 1898. So it is a turning point to some degree, but it's an accelerant. It's a catalyst, you might even say, of American imperialism. Now, the war began officially, it began with various independence struggles within the Spanish Empire, notably in Cuba in 1895 and 1896 in the Philippines. And Americans had long been interested in breaking Cuba away from Spain for a variety of reasons. In the antebellum period, there were pro-slavery people that really wanted Cuba. After the Civil War, we were looking to possibly help to influence the ending of slavery in the Caribbean. But Americans, for most of the 1800s, really did not like the Spanish. They viewed the Spanish as not white in the same way that they were. They spoke an unfamiliar language. They supposedly were violent and greedy, and they had been our enemies during the War of 1812. They had been on the British side in that conflict. So Americans across the 19th century did not like the Spanish, even though actually the Spanish had been our allies during the American Revolutionary War alongside France. But reports were coming out of, particularly out of Cuba, of a very brutal suppression of the Cuban independence movement. Attacks against civilians being rounded up into what were essentially concentration camps where they were brutally treated, starved. This was part of the Spanish counterinsurgency against the Cuban pro-independence, you might call them guerrillas. And Americans read about these reports. They were angered by them. It just made them dislike Spanish people even more, made them dislike Spaniards even more. But they were not looking to enter this conflict. However, the American press, particularly the papers that were run by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, they engaged in very sensationalized reporting, what is often called yellow journalism. And they wanted to lead the United States into war with Spain. So they tried to inflame public reporting against Spain to anger Americans, and they talked about all kinds of indignities against the Cubans and against even Americans who were in Cuba, often with a degree of exaggeration. There was truth to what the Spanish were doing, but there was often exaggeration as well, playing on American fears and Hispanophobia, or dislike and fear of the Spanish. But the yellow journalist press, they finally got what they were looking for in the sinking of the USS Maine. And the USS Maine was a sort of a proto-battleship from the period. It had been patrolling the harbor of Havana, basically to symbolize to the Spanish that if they escalated the war, if they continued their attacks against civilians and things like that, the U.S. would get involved. And in fact, the U.S. had already been blockading Cuba to keep the Spanish from getting more supplies and things like that. But we don't exactly know what happened to the Maine. It was thought that perhaps the vessel had struck a Spanish mine in the harbor. Others have suggested that perhaps the vessel had a boiler explosion, which these vessels are carrying all kinds of flammable and explosive materials, coal, gunpowder, weapons, and that the ship blew up, perhaps because of mechanical failure. But many people at the time believed that the vessel sunk because of the Spanish, that the sinking of this ship and the killing of Americans that took place was not done by accident. And the yellow journalist press really highlighted this, and it angered the American people who had opposed entering the war, but now that American lives had been lost, supposedly because of Spanish treachery, something that Americans believed the Spanish were inclined to, now the American people were ready for war. And here are some examples of the yellow journalistic press that's being used in the 1890s. And yellow journalism, partisan press, sensationalist press, if it bleeds, it leads. We have that today in the 21st century. Here's a very, very salacious image of the Spanish who are being very disrespectful to American women. The idea that the Spanish are lecherous and sexually not to be trusted was a common belief in the 19th century U.S. The image is actually done by Frederick Remington, the famous Western illustrator that I've shown images of before. Here's another cartoon of two leading newspapermen from the period, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. These two men were competitors, and they had some different political views. But over time, they both came to be supportive of a very partisan press that wanted the American people to go to war, that wanted to sell newspapers as well. If it bleeds, it leads. And Hearst was American-born, native-born, but Pulitzer was an immigrant from Hungary, and he was Jewish as well. And a lot of the cartoons of Pulitzer in particular portray him in a very, what we would call an anti-Semitic, stereotypical anti-Semitic manner. Casual racism and ethnocentrism, very common in American art during this period. So this is a quick rundown of the Spanish-American War, April to August of 1898. There's a reason it's called the Splendid Little War. It is a short conflict. In 1897, a year before the war begins, the regular U.S. Army, the professional soldiers, there's only about 28,000 troops. German military theorists at the time argued that this is too small for really there to be considered a true army based on how large the United States was. The U.S. had 63 million people in 1890, but they only had 28,000 troops. President McKinley, when war began, he'd wanted to avoid war with Spain, but he was an imperialist, and when the time came, he did support the war very avidly. And I went over the human rights abuses, you might call them, towards the Cuban people, and there was also some really brutal fighting going on in the Philippines as well. In order to have enough troops to successfully fight this conflict, the U.S. Army is going to draw on its National Guard, which the National Guard had been developing during the Gilded Age. It had become an important strike-breaking force during this period, and it had also become much more professionalized and standardized. The Army wanted 50,000 troops to augment its own regulars, but instead they got 220,000 who were from the National Guard or who volunteered for the purpose of fighting in this war. McKinley was a veteran of the Civil War. He believed that one of the biggest problems the Union faced in this conflict was not having a big enough army to suppress the Confederacy in the beginning, and that calling for troops after the war began is what caused the Upper South to leave the Union. Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops, you'll remember from AMH 2010, angered people particularly in states like Virginia. And the U.S. did not have very much intel on the strength of the Allied insurgents in the Caribbean or in the Philippines, or even the size of the Spanish force, but we built a very large army very quickly, which having a large army is fine, but you have to have enough supplies and food and uniforms for your troops. You also have to have enough medicine for them as well, because the Caribbean is a place of disease. It's a place of malaria and yellow fever, and germ theory is evolving in this period, but they don't totally understand yet that mosquitoes are an important vector for spreading malaria and yellow fever. They're beginning to make those connections, but disease is actually on the Spanish side in this conflict. In fact, military history theorists argue that the Spanish Empire, which was very weak and far less dynamic than other European empires, it lasted so long because of these diseases. Invading forces from places like the United States, they would be fighting disease as much as they were fighting the Spanish, who had already been living in the Caribbean and who already had immunity. So it's a little bit of almost like a naturally occurring bioweapon. But in the end, though, the U.S. does win very quickly because the Spanish military is overextended and many of their technologies are obsolete, especially when it comes to artillery. And in the beginning, this war, with its quick victory, was seen as a sign of American supremacy, American superiority. You might even say American racial supremacy, perhaps, as well. You might make that argument. As time goes on, though, historians have gotten more cynical. They argued this was an example of imperialism, of racial and ethnocentric motivations. Military historians have also gotten to be more cynical as well. They argue that while the U.S. mobilized a very large force very quickly, too many men died of disease, too many men did not have proper food and supplies, there wasn't enough standardization of weapons, and that yes, the U.S. may have defeated Spain, but that wasn't something to really brag about. Its logistics were too organized. There was equipment problems, ration problems, and about 5,400 Americans died in this war. Less than 400 were true combat deaths. Disease by far was the greatest killer in this conduct, especially amongst the volunteers, who were less disciplined than regular soldiers who knew how to keep their camps clean and keep disease a bit more at bay. And really the lesson of the Spanish-American War is that if the U.S. Army and the U.S. military is going to help make America an imperial power, there's going to need to be a bigger U.S. military. There's going to need to be more defense spending and more technological investment. For example, one of the things they come across is they realize they need more what are called immunes or immune soldiers, and they really will begin to pull from the southern states to fill up the Army's ranks, because Southerners living in a more mosquito-ridden part of the country, they're more likely to survive these tropical diseases, and that's going to lead to more military bases being built in the South. And it's actually also in part going to lead to the creation of income taxes to fund these new military bases. Something I talked about in my Progressive Era lecture. And this is another Puck magazine image, which is actually very pro-imperialism. It's showing Teddy Roosevelt of the 1st U.S. Volunteers, the Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders. They're fighting at San Juan Hill, chasing the Spanish away. They actually didn't have their famous horses at the Battle of San Juan Hill because, as I said, there were some really serious logistical challenges the U.S. military faced. I'm going to go over some of those in a few moments. Here's some images of the Rough Riders. They're wearing a mix of uniforms, both the old blue Army uniforms as well as the new khaki canvas uniforms that are a bit more camouflaging but also are much better for tropical warfare. In many cases, the U.S. volunteers who joined for the duration of the conflict, they were not professional regulars. They got the newest and the best equipment because they were the newest to the military. Here are some more famous images of the Spanish-American War, the Battle of San Juan Hill. The Rough Riders were not actually on their horses during the battle. The horses had not arrived from the United States yet. They were joined by African-American soldiers who are often known as Buffalo Soldiers. These men were already in the Army. They were regulars, so they have additional training, and they backed up the less tested volunteers. Teddy Roosevelt had some National Guard experience, but he was not a professional military officer. And he often disagreed with professional military officers, most notably Leonard Wood. In addition, the U.S. had artillery like Gatling guns that were used as well, that play a major role in the Spanish-American War. I'm classing the Gatling gun as an artillery weapon, artillery piece, because in the 19th century, Gatling guns were thought of more as artillery than as machine guns, the way we would think of them today. And here are Cuban independence guerrillas, partnering with U.S. troops. The U.S. did try to work with the Cubans, but they didn't have as much intel as they probably should have had about the strength of the Cuban forces, and so there was difficulties in partnering with the Cubans to defeat the Spanish. And part of the Spanish strategy was to try to outlast the Americans, rely on their heavily fortified positions in Cuba, and try to outlast them. But in the end, the U.S. does succeed, but not without very high disease-related casualties. Even leading U.S. military officers like William Shafter, for example, got very sick during the Battle of San Juan Hill and the siege of the Cuban position at Santiago, Cuba. This is the Model 1895 Browning machine gun. It's an automatic weapon. It uses gas from spent bullets to expel casings and to bring in the next round from the magazine. It's different than the older Gatling gun, which was crank operated. It was an automatic weapon powered by a crank. This weapon uses gases. Much like more like a modern machine gun, and it saw some service in the Spanish-American War, having been developed just a few years before. But older Gatling guns are going to be used as well because a variety of equipment is being used because of the rapid mobilization of the U.S. military. Here are some reproductions of uniforms worn by soldiers during the war. You can see the older blue uniforms are accompanied by the newer khaki uniforms. You can see bolt-action rifles, which are the new technology. They're supposed to be standard issue, but oftentimes older, much older percussion lock arms are issued as well, just because the challenges of the logistics, the logistical challenges of equipping such a large army so quickly lead to a lot of non-standard weapons being used and obsolete weapons being used, even by the United States during the Spanish-American War. Still, though, it's not enough to stop the U.S. from winning. This is the Santiago region of Cuba. This is where the Battle of San Juan Hill is taking place. And as you can see, the U.S. forces are going to come from Florida, primarily from the Tampa area. Disease is a major problem, not only in Cuba, but in the southern United States as well, which is one of the reasons why the U.S. will begin to set up more permanent military bases in the South. They want to be better prepared for future wars south of the United States, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America. And they also want to recruit more Southerners to join the U.S. military. This is the 1890s. The Civil War was only about 30 years earlier, and there's still reticence by white Southerners to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. And this is also going to drive the push for the lost cause and reconciliation, even within the U.S. government. It's about kind of getting the white Southerners back on the team, even as the U.S. is also recruiting African Americans to serve in the U.S. military as well. And African Americans were torn about the Spanish-American War. Should they fight for a country that allows things like the Jim Crow laws, that allows white supremacist organizations to victimize African Americans in the South? And some African Americans, though, decided that this was an opportunity to prove to white society they were patriotic, that they were strong, that they deserved equality with white Americans. And African Americans are going to take a similar stance in both the world wars as well. There was also fighting on Puerto Rico as well. On the whole, the United States encountered less Spanish resistance in Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico was captured by the United States as well, and Cuba was made an independent country, officially independent, but there were many U.S. interventions. But Puerto Rico was going to become a territory of the United States after the Spanish-American War, and the operations in Puerto Rico were overseen by none other than Nelson Miles, who defeated the Sioux in the Great Sioux War back in the 1870s. In fact, you'll see some similarities between how the United States fights in the Native American wars, the Indian wars, and how they're going to fight at the turn of the century. Women also took part in the Spanish-American War, serving in a variety of capacities. Women served in the anti-Spanish, especially the Cuban insurgencies, and were called mambisas. This is an image of one at left. Typically, for the United States, women did not serve in a combat capacity. They usually served in the medical corps as nurses. And they often served on hospital ships that would be stationed outside of harbors that would deal with the sick and the wounded from the battles. Duty on these hospital ships, however, could be very hazardous. High heat in the Caribbean and the Pacific, cramped spaces where accidents are very likely, mosquito-borne illnesses. Disease was the greatest killer in this war. I should add, though, that overall deaths from disease are still lower than other conflicts in American history. Soldiers in the Spanish-American War had about a 5% chance of dying of disease. This is largely due to advances in germ theory and sanitation by the 1890s. At the same time, though, doctors and scientists are still just getting around to discovering the idea that mosquitoes spread diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Clara Mas, a nurse who took part in the Spanish-American War on the American side. After the war, she actually volunteered to be bitten by a mosquito carrying yellow fever in 1901. So this is after the war, and she dies. But because of her death, her sacrifice, doctors are able to discover that mosquitoes do in fact spread diseases like yellow fever. Before discussing the Spanish-American War in the Pacific and conflicts that come after it, I want to talk about Puerto Rico a bit and why Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States. As of 2020, Puerto Rico has over 3 million inhabitants, twice as many people as Hawaii, and 4 times as many people as Alaska. And according to U.S. law, a territory can petition to become a state once it has 60,000 citizens, and Puerto Ricans became citizens in 1917, citizens of the United States. So why are they not a state then? There's many reasons for this. In the beginning, racial or racist concerns by the population of the United States forestalled Cuba becoming a U.S. state. Again, white Americans don't like Spanish people very much, even European Spanish people, and they don't believe that mixed race people and people of indigenous and African ancestry are equal to them. So there is a desire to not allow Puerto Ricans to become citizens for racial reasons. As time goes on, things do change, though. Economic concerns also are a major reason why Puerto Rico remains a territory to this day. And also local political concerns on the island of Puerto Rico as well. So initially, tariffs were a major concern in the 1890s and early 20th century. There were tariffs that were put on goods between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. After 1900, when the Puerto Rican civilian government was established, these tariffs were lowered, again, which is good for the Puerto Rican economy. And at the same time, though, while that is good to have a good deal with tariffs, Puerto Rico did not have the right to elect its own governor until after World War II. That was Luis Muñoz Marin in 1948. And there's been separatist movements in Puerto Rico for decades, even one that might be called a word that rhymes with error or errorist attack on the U.S. Capitol in 1954. I'm on YouTube, so I have to be careful what words I use. Those actors from Puerto Rico, they shot several members of Congress, and then they were actually pardoned by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. So there was a independence movement in Puerto Rico, and not without reason. But Puerto Rico has its own political parties in addition to voting for the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States. But Puerto Rico does not have representation in Congress. They do not have representation. They don't have 2 senators either. They don't get to vote in general elections for the president. They get to vote in the primaries, which is rather unusual. But the desire for independence, there are still independence activists in Puerto Rico, and there are also people who just want the status quo to be maintained. But the largest group, from what I've seen in Puerto Rico, having talked to Puerto Rican people and having looked into referenda and things like that have taken place, the majority of Puerto Ricans do support statehood. While statehood would mean paying federal income tax, you don't have to pay federal income tax as a territory. Puerto Rico would gain additional funding from the U.S. government. Puerto Rico is on the whole poorer than the 50 states, but they would gain additional funding, although they would have income taxes to pay. They would also gain representation in Congress, and they would gain U.S. senators as well. And I've seen in recent years a pretty sizable bipartisan support for the possibility of Puerto Rican statehood, it being perhaps the 51st state. So I don't know for sure, but it really wouldn't surprise me if in my lifetime, um, if we see Puerto Rico become a U.S. state. I could be wrong. It may remain as territory for economic tax reasons, for local political reasons, or it may possibly become its own independent nation. The independence and separatist groups could gain strength, but we'll see what happens. That's getting into the future. And the images on this slide are the Puerto Rican flag, which looks like kind of a inverse of the Cuban flag. Um, Agriculture was a major business in Puerto Rico. Those goods could be sent to the United States, exported to the United States, but it wouldn't really be a true export because they're a territory of the United States that's good for business. This is a picture of the Puerto Rican Supreme Court. As I mentioned, there were considerable interests in Puerto Rico that wanted to remain part of the American empire for both economic reasons and for local political reasons, because there are local political parties in Puerto Rico. And of course, poverty is a major issue, was and is a major issue in Puerto Rico. This is a quick rundown of U.S. military operations in the Philippines theater in the Spanish-American War. The U.S. Navy departed Hong Kong, which was a British possession, and arrived to fight the Spanish at the Battle of Manila. They defeated the Spanish Navy May 1st, 1898, essentially sank the Spanish Navy, and then were able to operate on the Philippine Islands. There are by a recent study, over 7,000 islands in the Philippine archipelago. And ground troops led by General Wesley Merritt, they partnered with Filipino revolutionaries led in part by Emiliano Aguinaldo. His name will be important later. And they're going to defeat the Spanish occupying force fairly quickly. During their operations on the islands, though, the land-based operations, the U.S. Generally regarded the Filipino insurgents in a secondary way. They were relegated to secondary status in these operations against the Spanish, which is going to lead to problems and eventually to the U.S.-Philippines War. This is a quick summary of the grand strategy and tactics used during the U.S.-Philippines War, 1899 to 1902. The fighting of the U.S.-Philippines War began February 4th, 1899, although relations between the U.S. and their Filipino allies, the Filipino revolutionaries, who were fighting against Spain for independence, these relations had been deteriorating really since the capture of Manila, because the U.S. was treating the Filipinos as secondary or auxiliary allies. And for the Filipinos, this is a fight for independence, it's a fight for their country. The war will continue until July 4th, 1902, but there's going to be some isolated pockets of fighting really as late as 1914. The Philippines, there are over 7,000 islands. There are many different ethnic groups and religious groups, so it's unsurprising that there's going to be continued fighting even after the main war is over. And the U.S. Fought the Filipino insurgents/revolutionaries really successfully, using tactics and strategies that had been employed successfully against Native Americans during the so-called Indian Wars. And there are some differences and similarities between the Indian Wars and the Philippines War, namely that the United States is fighting in islands. They can use their naval resources to great effect in terms of moving supplies and materiel and troops around. Also, at the same time, they're fighting across the other side of the Pacific, whereas in the Indian Wars, they were fighting on the North American continent. But the continuities between the Indian Wars and this U.S.-Philippines War are as follows. First, the U.S. achieved victory by exploiting divisions within Filipino society, really to keep the Filipinos divided. And I'll explain a bit more why and how they did this in subsequent slides. Next, what they'll do is they'll make alliances with some Filipinos and deploy them as scouts and as troops to gather intel. This is something that the United States had done in the Indian Wars as well, hiring Native American scouts, bringing in Native Americans into the U.S. Army, and making alliances with one Native American tribe against another. And alliances often shifted in the Indian Wars as well. And then lastly, and most controversially, the U.S. would use irregular warfare to compel hostile insurgents to surrender, and really to even compel neutral parties in the Philippines to align with the United States, to submit to the United States. And you can see an image of irregular warfare here on this slide. This was something that the U.S. had done in the Native American wars as well. Target Native American villages and settlements, target their food supply. That way they would have to surrender because they lacked basic sustenance. And the U.S. will do something similar in the Philippines. This will deprive the Filipinos of supplies they would need for continued resistance against the United States. And these attacks, some of which were reprisals for attacks on American troops, they'll dissuade Filipinos from continuing their hostility against the United States, and also convince neutrals to not ally with Filipino forces against the United States, that doing so will be costly and a futile thing. And the United States is successful with this irregular warfare counterinsurgency in the Philippines, even as they're going to struggle with fighting in Southeast Asia in the post-World War II years. The Philippines were a multi-ethnic country of thousands of islands. There are different ethnic groups, there are different religious groups, there are Roman Catholics, there are Muslims, and then in terms of the revolution, the Filipinos, not all of them wanted the same thing. Some Filipinos simply wanted independence, self-determination, as future U.S. President Woodrow Wilson would call it. Others wanted to really reform Filipino society. Their goals were much more revolutionary. They wanted to dismantle some of the almost like caste systems that Filipino culture had, and they wanted to minimize the role of the Catholic Church in Philippine life and culture. And this was something that really plays to the United States, because the United States is able to exploit these divisions. They will fight against Filipino forces. It'll be the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army will also employ African American troops, Buffalo soldiers as they were often called in the period, to fight in the Philippines as well. And as time goes on, many Americans began to question, why are we here? How are we any better than the Spanish, depriving the Filipinos of their independence? There were concerns, though, during the period that what would happen to the Philippines as an independent nation. Were the Filipinos ready to be an independent country on their own? And some of those ideas were rooted in the contemporary racism of the period, that the Filipinos, as non-white people, were not strong enough to stand on their own. But at the same time, the Philippines are a very strategic region. In order to get between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, you have to sail through these islands. And so it's an important gateway. And if these islands were then taken over by another country, the consequences could have been very bad for the United States, and really for the balance of power in the Pacific, because the U.S. is not the only player in the Pacific. The British are in the Pacific. They have a presence, as does France, as does Germany, and as does Japan, a rising power, a rising sun, you might call them. And President William McKinley was often pressed about the U.S. continuing its fight in the Philippines, and you might say betraying the principles for which they had gone to war. And President McKinley seemed to take this very personally. He would often, in his remarks, be very touchy about the subject. And he basically said, in paraphrase, that if we didn't control those territories, somebody else would have. And that was how he defended this conflict. But in the end, the United States does succeed in defeating the Filipino insurgents, revolutionaries, and maintaining control of the country. And the U.S. rule or colonization of the Philippines was always meant to be temporary. The plan was to allow the Philippines to become independent. And the Philippines would eventually be granted independence in 1946 after World War II, and after a really, really brutal occupation of the Philippines by Japanese forces. And here are some more images related to the U.S.-Philippines War. This is a Judge magazine cartoon, Judge being a political cartoon magazine that was aligned with the Republican Party. supported the Republican Party agenda, which in this period was imperialism. It shows Uncle Sam using the Philippines as a trading spot and a sort of a stopover to gaining access to the markets of China, and also that Uncle Sam is going to bring civilization to China first by taking control of the Philippines. And here are images of the fighting in the Philippines, which was insurgency and counterinsurgency. It was jungle warfare. There were things that we might call atrocities or war crimes committed by many different factions in this war by U.S. troops and by Filipino forces as well. Particularly towards prisoners of war who were often treated very, very badly, leading to things like reprisals. This is an image of U.S. soldiers performing what was called the water cure on a captured Filipino prisoner, and this is an early form of waterboarding, to extract information from people. As I said, prisoners were often very badly treated during the U.S.-Philippines War. Violence towards prisoners of war, violence towards civilians were committed by multiple factions during this conflict. One example is during the fight against the Moro people. And the Moro rebellion kind of takes place towards the end of the Philippines War and will actually continue afterwards. The Moro were an ethnic group that was predominantly Muslim, and when they challenged the United States, the bodies of the dead Moro insurgents, they would be buried in mass graves, often with pig carcasses, because pigs are unclean and essentially sacrilegious to Muslim people. And by burying pigs with the bodies of the dead, they were essentially desecrating the bodies of the Muslim Moro insurgents. And this was done to intimidate the Moros and to compel them into surrendering. And then the image at the top right of this slide is of Macabebe, or Maccabee Scouts as they're called, and they were a Filipino faction that was aligned with the United States. As I said, different groups of Filipinos had different goals. Some simply just wanted independence. Others wanted to completely remake Filipino society, and the U.S. is able to exploit those differences to ensure victory. This is a Puck magazine cartoon, which Puck magazine sometimes had imperialist and sometimes anti-imperialist cartoons. And this cartoon is intended to mock the anti-imperialists domestically in the United States. It shows anti-imperialists, men in women's clothing to emasculate them, to show that they're not following proper gender norms, they're not being men, not being masculine, by bowing down to a sort of very cartoonish, you might even argue racially stereotypical image of Emilio Algonado, who was an important leader of the main Filipino resistance against the United States. The idol of the aunties, the cartoon calls the anti-imperialists, and you can see famous American politicians, most notably here William Jennings Bryan, who is going to run for president again in 1900. And Bryan was a committed anti-imperialist. He criticized U.S. foreign policy in the Philippines as being cruel to the Filipino people. Bryan believed that the violence of this war in the Philippines would get in the way of bringing Christianity to the Philippines, or Protestant Christianity, because Catholicism already had a strong presence in the Philippines. And in American foreign policy, the United States' adversaries abroad, they pay close attention to domestic American politics, because a change in presidential administrations can lead to a change in foreign policy goals. And the same was the case in 1900. Filipino revolutionaries would have hoped that William Jennings Bryan, the anti-imperialist, would win the presidency, and William McKinley, the imperialist who was in favor of taking control of the Philippines, that he would be out, that he would lose. In the end, of course, McKinley wins, being the hero of, the incumbent president who oversaw the successful Spanish-American War. Another very famous anti-imperialist as well was Mark Twain, who supported the Filipinos and their independence. Sometimes people supported anti-imperialism for very good reasons. They wanted to protect the self-determination of other cultures. They wanted to uphold the values of freedom and liberty, as described in the Declaration of Independence. Others, unfortunately, often had what you might call chauvinistic goals in why they supported anti-imperialism. You might argue that in some ways Bryan's support of anti-imperialism was chauvinistic because he wanted to spread Protestant Christianity to the Philippine Islands. But there also were racist factions in American society who did not want non-white Filipinos to be part of the United States because they might, as people of color, become citizens. Samuel Gompers, the leader of the AFL, was against imperialism and against the annexation of the Philippines. He feared that having the Philippines would lead to more people coming to the United States, namely non-white Asian people from the Philippines and from places like China, possibly Chinese people getting around the Chinese Exclusion Act, coming to the Philippines first and then coming to the United States, continental U.S. So Gompers was trying to protect the job prospects of American workers, which is understandable, but some of his other ideas about race we would criticize today. But imperialism and anti-imperialism, they can be very complex, and there's quite a bit of nuance in these discussions. And now we'll go over the effects of the Spanish-American War. The Spanish Empire was dissolved. This leads to a malaise in Spanish culture. It's often called the Generation of 98. Young Spanish people who came of age during this period felt very disillusioned. They lamented the loss of their country's empire, and ultimately this will in part lead Spain to remain neutral in the First World War. The U.S. has territorial gains. They gain Puerto Rico, which is still a territory. They gain Guam, which is still a territory. And they gain the Philippines, which became its own independent country after World War II. Cuba is going to remain a protectorate of the United States until 1934 via the Platt Amendment. This was an amendment in the Cuban Constitution that gave the United States, reserved the United States the right to intervene militarily in Cuban affairs. So they may not have officially have been part of the American empire. Formally, they were a part of what diplomatic historians might call the informal empire of America, where American products were sold in Cuba, and then America could deploy troops in the country if the United States deemed that it was beneficial to American interests to do so. And the Spanish-American War, it accelerates American imperialism abroad over the overseas. Again, America in some ways has always been an empire since the beginning, but we're going to become much more of an overseas empire, and we're really going to become a committed world power after 1898, and certainly after the end of the U.S.-Philippines War. We're going to protect our interests economically, and we're going to spread American values, or we will claim to spread American values to the people of the world, particularly the people in the Caribbean and in Latin America, our backyard, as President Teddy Roosevelt called the Caribbean and Latin America. And this is an image of President McKinley, an imperialist, as a waiter serving Uncle Sam a Cuba steak, a Puerto Rico pig, the Philippine floating islands being a dessert that was popular in this period, and then the Sandwich Islands, which is an old term for the Hawaiian Islands. The United States also captured Guam during the Spanish-American War as well, and Guam is still a territory of the United States today. It was ceded officially to the U.S. By Spain in 1899 as part of the end of the Spanish-American War, although the U.S. had captured it a year earlier. And Guam will serve as a naval station, and it's a spot where American ships will stop to resupply, to take on loads of coal, and it's also there occupied to prevent German expansion. Germany is trying to build a overseas empire for itself in the Pacific during this period, And the United States is interested in stopping that, as are other European empires. They want to maintain the balance of power in the Pacific, just as they want to maintain the balance of power in Europe. In the beginning, the island of Guam was ruled by the U.S. military, with much of the populace opposed to foreign U.S. rule. Um, and Guam will be captured by the Japanese during World War II, where the Guamanian people will be treated very badly by the Japanese. After World War II in 1915, the people of Guam gained U.S. citizenship, and the island remains as a territory today. This is Wake Island as well, which was acquired alongside Guam. It's a very small island, no indigenous inhabitants, but a very strategic location that was again captured by the Japanese during World War II. These small islands could be used as coaling stations for U.S. Navy ships, and eventually they're going to be very important airstrips for aircraft as well. The United States will also acquire American Samoa in 1900, and they're acquiring it for, again, because of the imperial game that's being played in the Pacific. They don't want Germany or Britain to get control of more territory in the Samoan Islands region. And this annexation was handled in a somewhat more ethical and democratic manner. There was evidence of more support for annexation from the Samoan people. And the images on this slide are of the flag of American Samoa, as well as Samoan troops guarding the islands during the World War II years. Now we'll turn our attention north towards the mainland of Southeast Asia, specifically towards China, and we're going to discuss the Boxer Rebellion. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the European empires were essentially trying to carve up the Chinese empire into their own spheres of influence. These were areas in which each European power would have the ability to keep other empires out, and they would have a great degree of influence on the local Chinese culture and on politics. So essentially they were dismembering China as a country. And the Qing dynasty, which ruled China, was generally not in a position where they had enough strength to resist the dismemberment of China. And you can see this cartoon here shows the various European powers: Britain, Russia, France, even Japan, an Asian power, is beginning to enter into the Chinese territory. And Uncle Sam here is attempting to stop this dismemberment of China with what will eventually be called the open door policy. But I'll explain what the open door policy is soon. And this is a cartoon showing Uncle Sam and President McKinley fighting against Chinese insurgents known as the Boxers, and the Boxers are portrayed in a very stereotypical manner in this cartoon. Remember, during this period, Chinese immigration into the United States is essentially banned, and the average American, the average white American, does not have a very high opinion of the Chinese. Here are U.S. Marines during the Boxer Rebellion, and the Boxer Rebellion was fought from 1899 to 1901, so it actually is being fought during the U.S.-Philippines War. And then it's going to be followed up by another conflict between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War. And during the Boxer Rebellion, the various European powers and Japan are all going to be allied against the Boxers. The Boxers were Chinese insurgents who opposed their country being essentially dismembered by foreign powers. The Chinese people have a long, proud history. They refer to their country as the Middle Kingdom, and they did not want other countries that they saw as being outsiders or barbarians dividing up their country. They wanted self-determination. The United States allied itself with the European powers against the Boxers. Should also add there were some Chinese people that were on the side of the Europeans and the Americans. The Japanese, I'm classing within the category of the Europeans, because they were on the same side together, even though they're not European. The Boxers had attempted to de-Westernize and remove any kind of European influence from Japan. Railroads, Western businesses, even churches could be destroyed, and Chinese Christians were often killed by the Boxers. There were factions within the Chinese government that supported the Boxers and those that were opposed. The Dowager Empress of China supported the Boxers in an attempt to try to keep her country together. But in the end, the Boxers are going to be defeated. And they're called the Boxers because of the way they fought. They used hand-to-hand combat, traditional Chinese martial arts. In the English vernacular of the day was called boxing, even though it's not really boxing in the Western sense. But the Boxers would have called themselves the Society of the Divine and Harmonious Fists. To some, they would have been patriots. They would have been nationalists fighting against foreign occupiers. To others, they would have been seen as a dangerous threat, against Chinese Christians or against missionaries or against American and European and business interests in the country. The Boxers had large numbers in their forces, but they did not have a large supply of modern weapons, and so they're going to struggle against the United States and against the Europeans and against the Japanese. And this image on the left-hand side, you see the international army that fights against the Boxers. We see a Japanese soldier. This is based on the uniforms, a British soldier, a American soldier. There's a British Indian soldier as well, and there are Italian and French soldiers and a German soldier too. Again, multiple European empires and Japan all had their sights on China. This is a famous painting of a battle during the Boxer Rebellion. It's called All Try Sir, featuring American troops climbing the walls into the city of Beijing. Back then it was called Peking. This happened in August of 1900. This was a very famous battle in which the U.S. Marine Corps, future very famous Marines like Smedley Butler and Dan Daly took part in the Boxer Rebellion. And what essentially happened is the Boxers, outnumbering the Imperial forces, had trapped them in a part of the city of Peking, in part of the city that's very near the old Forbidden City in Beijing. And the U.S. relief force arrived to help the Europeans and the Japanese, but they had to actually climb part of the walls of Beijing to relieve them from the advances of the Boxers. And the Boxer Rebellion in the United States was a polarizing event as well, just as the U.S.-Philippines War was. Mark Twain, who had opposed U.S. imperialism in the Philippines, also opposed the U.S. involvement in the Boxer Rebellion as well. He said it was understandable that the Boxers were fighting against the Europeans and attacking churches and things like that because their country was being taken from them. Smedley Butler himself, years later, also condemned the U.S. involvement in the Boxer Rebellion. I see the U.S.'s involvement in the Boxer Rebellion as a bit more complex. The United States was allying itself with the European powers and with Japan against the Boxers, against indigenous forces. But at the same time, the United States, in helping out these European powers, it then has control over the peace deal that is made. For example, the United States forces the other empires to abandon their strategy of spheres of influence and instead keep China together as one country, which is a good thing for the Chinese people, for Chinese national identity. At the same time, the United States demanded something called the open door policy. Essentially, the U.S. would be able to sell goods in China anywhere in China without any of the European empires stopping them, and really Chinese markets would be open to foreign goods, whether or not the Chinese wanted those goods to be in their country. And it's not as good of a deal for the European empires, who no longer have areas where they can sell their products and where other nations sell their products now. Everyone is competing against each other for the Chinese market. But it's especially good for the United States, which was a manufacturing powerhouse at the turn of the century period. It was a net exporter of goods. So even in the United States' push to keep China together as one country, there's still a self-serving element to this. Also, I should add that the failure of the Boxer Rebellion, it will contribute to the collapse of the Qing dynasty and of the Chinese imperial government. And the Chinese imperial dynasties had ruled China intermittently for nearly 5,000 years since the Shang dynasty. The United States acquires the Virgin Islands in 1917 on the backdrop of World War I, the First World War. The United States wanted to have additional bases from which it could launch destroyers to target German U-boats, which were doing a lot of damage to United States shipping and to Allied or Entente shipping during World War I. That was leading to the deaths of Americans at sea. At the time, the Virgin Islands were a possession of Denmark, but they were too expensive to Denmark. Denmark was eager to sell these islands so that it could continue to fight in World War I using the proceeds. And the United States, under President Wilson, was looking to establish bases of operations, additional bases of operations beyond just Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to, again, protect American shipping. It's a major maritime route. It also protects the Panama Canal, too, because the Panama Canal was finished in 1914. You want to be able to not only ship to Europe, but you want to be able to ship from the Caribbean and the Atlantic region all the way over into the Pacific Ocean. And the islanders will get citizenship in 1927. And the majority of the island's population was people of African descent who had been brought to those islands as slaves. After World War II, the United States acquires the Northern Mariana Islands. They'd been captured during World War II, and the islands had previously been ruled by Germany until the end of World War I, and then by Japan. And the Japanese had practiced very harsh rule over the islands and imposed their culture on the Mariana Islanders both before and during World War II. And so it's understandable that the people of the Northern Mariana Islands wouldn't want to have anything to do with Japan. The islands formally joined the U.S. as a territory in 1986, in which the islanders gained citizenship to the United States. So they gained citizenship as they officially became a territory of the U.S., although they had been occupied for 40 years earlier. But studies show that over time, the residents of these islands want to be more integrated to the U.S., not less integrated. So this is a form of American imperialism that you could say is more democratic and more ethical. Before continuing on, I want to do a roundup on post-Spanish-American War foreign policy. America is becoming a true world power in this region. We are building our overseas empire, and we begin to see ourselves as the world police, as arbiters in disputes. We had done that during the Boxer Rebellion, although on terms that were very beneficial to the United States. And we're going to make the world safe for democracy, in the words of future President Woodrow Wilson. So the president right after William McKinley, you'll remember, was Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt supported big stick diplomacy. It comes from an old African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. The United States should spend on its military and on its army, on its navy, on its Marine Corps, but it shouldn't go around picking fights indiscriminately, needlessly. It should be careful, but then be prepared to back up our foreign policy and interests. But Roosevelt also did believe in interventions. He was an imperialist. He just believed that they should not be done as indiscriminately as perhaps the European empires were doing things. Americans believed their empire was better than the empires of Europe. In some ways, the American empire was better. In other ways, it was making the same mistakes. Anyway, with Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy, he oversaw the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War, America acted as a referee, as a treaty mediator between the empires of Russia and Japan. And you also see something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, it goes all the way back to the presidency of James Monroe in the 1820s. And in the Monroe Doctrine, basically, to put it simply, the Monroe Doctrine said Europe, keep out of the Western Hemisphere and keep out of Latin America and the Caribbean. During that period, the Latin American nations were having revolutions. They were breaking away from Spain. And France had also interests in those regions. And basically, America was saying that Europe needed to give up those regions and let the people of those countries have freedom on their own terms. The Roosevelt Corollary was an addition. That's what a corollary is. It was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. It was Europe, keep out of Latin America and the Caribbean, because Latin America and the Caribbean are America's backyard. It's America's sphere of interest. We're going to be in charge here. We're going to be the hegemons in the Western Hemisphere, not you. So it's a challenge to Britain that still has a presence in the Western Hemisphere, most notably in Canada, but it's also a challenge particularly to the rising power of Germany that's going to try to gain a foothold in Latin America. They're going to try to collect debts and things like that. In Venezuela in 1902, the U.S. will stop them from doing that. And the idea was the U.S. must protect the weaker nations of Latin America, the people of color of Latin America, from the predatory empires of Europe. Again, there's kind of a white man's burden idea, although in this case it's the white men of America protecting non-white men from the white men of Europe. That's the expectation. In reality, these interventions often are done for domestic business considerations as much as they are for military or economic concerns, the welfare of the people of those countries. And often these interventions and the overall idea about American foreign policy in the period is based on racist and paternalistic beliefs about non-white people. They cannot stand on their own, they cannot have self-determination, and they need to be protected from other European or from the old European empires. And I also want to say the progressive era values, they do inform U.S. foreign policy. Our three progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, were all imperialists, all three of them. They just approached imperialism in different ways. There were very strong progressive imperialists. They believed they were fixing problems abroad. There also were some anti-imperialist progressives. William Jennings Bryan was an anti-imperialist, and he was part of the progressive movement. So again, there is nuance between progressivism and imperialism. These are some images of Teddy Roosevelt as a young man. He was from a wealthy New York family of Dutch descent. But he was sickly as a young child, Teddy Roosevelt. Or actually, when he was a kid, they called him TD, which is kind of unusual. But he trained physically. He played sports. At Harvard University, he was a rower. This is actually young Teddy, or TD as they would have called him, in his rowing uniform. He also spent time out west ranching. Here he is dressed up as a rancher, a little bit like a cowboy, and as a hunter. He's living in the American West in a period where it is really ceasing to be the frontier, and he wants to capture that vitality and that strength of the frontier struggle. He wants to capture that in American foreign policy and American imperialism. He's very vitalistic. He believes struggle makes people stronger. He's a believer in Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier Thesis. And Roosevelt was fascinated with the frontier. He wrote about it in books. He also wrote books about history in general, American history especially, and he also wrote about the importance of having a strong navy. So again, Teddy Roosevelt is an imperialist and a progressive, combining the progressive impulse to study and to educate and to fix social problems with his own beliefs about gender and masculinity in the frontier. And here we see a depiction, two depictions of the Russo-Japanese War, one from the Japanese perspective at top, and the other from the Russian perspective on the bottom. And here is an American depiction of the war of President Roosevelt presiding over the treaty between these two countries, forcing the Russian Tsar and the Japanese government to sign a treaty. And Japan won this war, and they won it very commandingly. Japan was rapidly modernizing, rapidly industrializing, and really it was adopting Western military technology and traditions. And the Russians went into this war extremely overly confident. They held some beliefs about the Japanese that were not good, and they lost. Of course, the Japanese have a logistical advantage. They're fighting in their own near their own heartland in the Japanese home islands and in that region, whereas the Russians are fighting on their Pacific coast. It's very far away, thousands of miles from the Russian heartland in the near Eastern Europe. So the Japanese were at an advantage, but the Japanese felt that they had been disrespected in this war. They felt that they didn't get as good of a treaty out of this conflict as they should have, and this is going to lead to resentment in Russia. I'm sorry, in Japan against the United States. They were being disrespected. They were being treated like a junior power in the region. And it's also going to lead to the breakdown of civilian government in Japan. It's going to lead, some historians would argue, to the rise of the Japanese military leadership taking over control of the country after World War I, which that will lead to World War II. Here are some additional images related to the Roosevelt Corollary. Here is Teddy Roosevelt commanding the U.S. Great White Fleet. I know it's the Great White Fleet because the ships are painted in white with a red stripe at the bottom of the hull, and they're challenging Britain, which is trying to collect debts from the non-white people of the Caribbean, in this case of Santo Domingo. Again, it's the white man's burden. It's the white man is protecting the non-white man from other white men. And here, Teddy Roosevelt has his big stick diplomacy. He has his U.S. Navy, which is going to be used for debt collection and all kinds of things that are also really in the interest of the United States, more so than they are in the interest of these people in the Caribbean and Latin America. While these countries are not being directly colonized or brought into the American empire, the formal American empire, they're in some ways being brought into the informal American empire, where the U.S. has influence over their affairs and can intervene in their politics. This might be considered a form of neocolonialism that will breed resentment in Latin America against the United States. Here are some images of the Great White Fleet. Teddy Roosevelt studied naval power and history, and American politicians and scholars, they had really come around to the idea in the late 1800s and early 1900s that in order to have a successful empire, in order to have a successful global economy, you had to have a large navy. These were the ideas of a military theorist named Alfred Thayer Mahan, and Teddy Roosevelt definitely had some Mahanian ideas, as they're called. And this is the Great White Fleet. There were 8 ships, white hulls with red stripes, and they were the latest, greatest technology at the time. And they were meant to basically flex our naval muscles, particularly towards Great Britain and towards Germany. Great Britain being a long-standing naval power, historically the most powerful navy in the world. The U.S. is really challenging Britain for that title, but so is Germany. Germany is building its own high seas fleet, as it's called during this period. And I just wanted to give a couple of stats about naval technology during this period, and just people often question, why were these coal stations, why were these island outposts, and you might call them naval centers in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Why were they so important? Well, it's an 11,800 mile journey from San Diego, California to Hong Kong. Hong Kong being a British city, British colony, but a very important trade destination. And the coal-powered battleships, or dreadnoughts as they're often called, they can sail about 5,000 miles on 1,800 tons of coal, traveling about 7 to 10 knots. And if they're traveling a lot faster, then their efficiency drops substantially. It drops to about a tenth of this when they're at full steam at 19 knots, which you're going to be steaming a lot quicker in wartime. So you need to have these coaling stations set up throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Pacific. That way you can get all the way across is actually going to lead the United States and other countries to switch to oil-powered engines by World War I, because they're still steam turbines, but they're, instead of burning coal, they're burning oil, which is much more efficient. So there's just the tyranny of distance is what military historians call it. Yes, some of these ideas, they violate the self-determination of the indigenous peoples of these islands, that's for sure. Yes, racist and paternalistic beliefs did animate U.S. foreign policy in this period, but the technology of the day made it that if you wanted to keep up with the other world powers, you had to have these outposts, these coaling stations. And they do become a bit less essential as military technology and as naval technology improves. And this map here illustrates what I was talking about in the previous slide. It's what military historians would call the tyranny of distance. It's 2,100 miles to get from the Pacific coast to Honolulu. But in order to get across the Pacific to Japan or to the Philippines, you're going to need to resupply here. That way you can make this much longer journey. Similar with Alaska. The Alaskan Aleutian Islands are especially important if you want to have trade networks and if you want to have a military presence in the northern Pacific. If you want to have a successful global navy and successful global trade in this period, you're going to need a quicker and easier route between the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Pacific. And this is where the Panama Canal comes in. For decades, Europeans and Americans had looked for routes across the narrow parts of Central America to get to the Pacific. There have been proposals to set up canals in Nicaragua and to set up canals possibly even in southern Mexico using bodies of water that were already there, extant bodies of water. But Panama is the shortest distance. In some parts of the Isthmus of Panama, you can actually see from one side of the ocean to the other. France began construction of the Panama Canal in 1881, and as time went on, though, France struggled to complete the construction. There were accidents, all kinds of holdups, but the biggest issue was disease. Malaria and yellow fever were decimating the crews of French and local workers, and even workers from other parts of the Caribbean who were brought in. And the United States wants to take control of the construction to finish the canal, finish the job the French had started. So in 1903, the United States will support a revolution in Panama against Colombia. Colombia had controlled Panama up to this point. And the Panamanians had reason to want independence. They felt isolated from Colombia. They wanted to have increased economic growth. It wasn't just about the Panama Canal, but the U.S. was definitely operating in a self-interested manner as well and trying to stoke the flames of revolution in Panama. After the revolution, the U.S. will take over control of construction in 1904, and about this time they make the discovery that mosquitoes are what are spreading yellow fever, and the best way to prevent these diseases is to wipe out the mosquito population, wipe out standing water, treat it with chemicals to keep the mosquitoes from laying eggs and having their larvae hatch. And once the United States figures this out, again, the sacrifices of people like Nurse Clara Moss, for example, who essentially allowed herself to become a medical experiment to prove that mosquitoes spread these diseases. The death rate for workers dropped significantly, and the U.S. was able to finish construction of the canal 10 years later in 1914. And really, it's one of the greatest engineering marvels ever made. The Panama Canal rises over 85 feet in a series of locks, and it's about 50 miles long. Years ago, I had my grandparents, they went on a cruise of the Panama Canal, and they were very, very impressed with the construction they saw. And it cost $375 million to build. It'd be about $8.5 billion in today's money. During its construction, over 5,600 workers died, many of whom were Afro-Caribbean migrant workers who were brought in and who died of yellow fever and of accidents and things like that. But once the U.S. took over the project, and once they discovered that malaria was spread by mosquitoes, the death rate dropped significantly, and there were about 300 American deaths on this project. After the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick diplomacy, William Howard Taft oversaw dollar diplomacy. And dollar diplomacy was meant to be a kinder, gentler form of American imperialism. It was meant to be economic in nature. America could influence other countries by offering them loans, offering them grants, and doing business with them, rather than sending the U.S. military to deploy and intervene in their countries. The belief was these countries needed education and training from the United States to be able to better handle money and be more fiscally responsible. That was what dollar diplomacy theorists, or financial missionaries is sometimes the term that's used to describe them. And there are going to be fewer military interventions during Taft's presidency. They don't stop completely, but there's not going to be as many military operations during this period. But again, business interests are still important. Business interests motivated military interventions, and they motivate these dollar diplomacy deals as well. Critics of dollar diplomacy, most notably Teddy Roosevelt, who had been a friend, an ally of Taft, they said that this approach was too friendly to banks and too friendly to big business, as opposed to being more direct and being more active, in foreign policy. Teddy Roosevelt was a man of action. He was not a man that was beholden to big business and big banks, the way Taft was. Again, supposedly, Taft was a progressive like Roosevelt. He just believed in using financial and economic power, soft power, rather than hard military power. And dollar diplomacy was retired by President Woodrow Wilson, Taft's successor, who replaced it with something that was called moral diplomacy. It was meant to be much more idealistic and was intended to be much fairer and much closer to American values, although Woodrow Wilson was an imperialist as well, and he did believe in military interventions in Latin America, as you're going to see. And this cartoon here shows the vitalistic and strong Teddy Roosevelt in his hunting clothing, leaving the big stick diplomacy, and he's being replaced with the almost effeminate nursemaid of William Taft and dollar diplomacy. This is a map showing the major United States interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as America is expanding its imperial reach and its foreign policy beyond its borders on the North American continent. You can see that the United States acquires Puerto Rico in 1898 and the Danish Virgin Islands in 1917. Cuba is a independent nation but a protectorate of the United States from 1898 to 1934, and there are multiple interventions in Cuba during this period that are sanctioned via the Platt Amendment. You'll notice the interventions, they do slow down during the presidency of William H. Taft. Taft was a proponent of dollar diplomacy, economic imperialism rather than military imperialism, hard power imperialism. And there are fewer interventions during the Taft presidency. Taft, of course, being president after winning the 1908 election, he was president from 1909 to 1913. The interventions don't stop, but they minimize. And the interventions will pick up again during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who was known for what was called moral foreign policy. And we'll discuss Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy, how moral it was, and in particular we'll discuss the interventions in Mexico, because that became a region of significant conflict during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. And these wars are often called the Banana Wars because these interventions are taking place often to aid U.S. business interests, especially the interests of fruit companies that grow bananas and things like that in the Caribbean and Latin America. Private American citizens also got involved in military operations in Latin America. The United States wanted to keep European powers from interfering with the affairs of these Latin American and Caribbean nations, but far less was done to stop American citizens from getting involved in these countries. And in some ways, this actually goes back to the old American tradition of filibustering, which took place in the mid 1800s, in which Americans would go to countries like Nicaragua, for example, or Cuba, and would try to topple the local government and then take over themselves. In 1912, an American mercenary named Lee Christmas helped to lead a military coup against the Honduran government. And the Cuyamel Fruit Company did this to basically remove their competition, the United Fruit Company, from the country of Honduras. Of course, in the 1950s, the United Fruit Company will orchestrate a coup in Guatemala with the assistance of the CIA. And military interventions by the United States, actions by private American citizens, these were often, in many cases, very damaging, devastating even to these developing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, countries that in many cases already had significant financial problems. The Honduran government had a problem paying its foreign debts, and the United States did not try to stop what Lee Christmas was doing, and these actions gave rise to the term "banana republic," in which a developing country has its economy and its politics significantly influenced in a very corrupt manner by foreign businesses, especially fruit companies. It's not the overpriced store in the mall. I enjoy talking about sports in history. I talked about surfing earlier in this video, so I thought I'd mention baseball briefly as well. Many nations have baseball culture, baseball being very popular in their country, even though baseball in many ways is the quintessential American sport, Americans' national pastime. But if a country outside of the United States likes baseball, there's a good chance that that country was either occupied by the U.S. military or had a significant American, especially American military presence within its borders for a long period of time. And if you look at maps of Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, countries that had a lot of U.S. military interventions, baseball is the most popular sport. This is the case in Cuba and in the Dominican Republic, and it's also, to a lesser degree, the case in Nicaragua as well. I've been to Nicaragua. Baseball is pretty popular there, as is soccer, whereas countries that had either no interventions or fewer interventions, soccer is more popular. Mexico, of course, had American interventions during the early 20th century, but not long-term occupations throughout the entire country the way you see with some of the smaller Caribbean and Latin American countries. And the image on this slide is actually from France in World War I, but it's still illustrative of American soldiers during this period playing baseball and bringing baseball to whatever country they've been deployed in. And you'll also notice this pattern in Japan as well. Japan was occupied for many years by the United States after World War II, and baseball is very popular in Japan, and many Japanese baseball players come to the United States to play in the MLB. Now we'll discuss the foreign policy of President Woodrow Wilson, the imperialism of President Woodrow Wilson. It's often known as moral diplomacy. It's different than the big stick diplomacy of Teddy Roosevelt and the dollar diplomacy of William Taft. It was meant to be much more idealistic. President Wilson was a man of strong ideals and principles. He was an educated intellectual, a college professor before he became president, and his goal was to make the world safe for democracy. That was language he used to describe American foreign policy. America's southern neighbor, Mexico, from 1910 to 1920, was in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. We don't have time to go into the exact details of why the revolution took place, but as time went on, the country was taken over by a man named Victoriano Huerta, and Huerta was a dictator, and he became an increasingly violent, oppressive, and authoritarian dictator. He'd taken control of the country in a violent coup, and President Wilson, rightfully so, saw him as a threat to moral diplomacy and to Mexico. To make matters worse, Huerta was becoming closer with Germany as well. Germany in the early 20th century was becoming a new and major enemy of the United States, and Germany was trying to gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas, which contradicted the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but it was also a threat to the moral foreign policy of President Wilson. They were trying to supply Huerta with weapons which would be used against the Mexican people. Consequently, the United States began to support factions in the Mexican Revolution, primarily Venustiano Carranza, and to a lesser degree, Pancho Villa. Carranza was a supporter of the Constitutionalist faction in the Mexican Revolution. He wanted to have the country be governed by a constitution, something that Wilson could support, making the world safe for democracy. Villa also initially was an ally of Carranza, but as time goes on, Carranza's faction, the Constitutionalists, they become more powerful, and essentially they are winning the Mexican Revolution, and a rift develops between Villa and between Carranza. And as a rift develops between Villa and Carranza, a rift develops between Villa and the United States. Should also add to that over time, Carranza had to back away from receiving assistance from the United States. Doing so would make him look like a illegitimate foreign puppet. There was a lot of Anglophobia, American phobia in the in Mexico, and not without reason. Think about the U.S.-Mexican War back in the 1840s. The Wilson administration did not want to support other factions within the Mexican Revolution. Some of those other factions, most notably the faction of Emiliano Zapata, with their plans for large-scale land reform and things of that nature, it was too radical for Wilson to support. To make matters worse, though, there are American business interests in Mexico. There are American expats that live in the country, and the United States had dispatched ships to Veracruz, an important Mexican port city, to officially to keep any kind of German weapons from entering the country. In the spring of 1914, American troops would disembark from their vessels in Veracruz. They would do what sailors often do, become intoxicated, get a little too rowdy, and they were arrested by the Mexican police and thrown in jail. They were quickly released with apologies from local Mexican law enforcement, but this diplomatic faux pas, you might say, gave Wilson and the United States the pretext to occupy the city of Veracruz, and they occupied it from April to November of 1914. And during this occupation, actually in the summer of 1914, the Great War, or World War I, begins, in which Britain, France, Russia, and their allies are going to be fighting Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and their allies. So the United States will be an ally of Britain and France, which will only make the U.S.-German relationship worse. And as I mentioned before, Wilson's relationship with Carranza and Villa will also fall apart over time, especially with Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa's region of control in Mexico was in the northern part of the country, adjacent to the U.S. border. And as relations between Villa and the United States decayed, Villa began to attack and in some cases execute American expats who were in Mexico. And allegedly, because he had been sold defective weapons, Villa will actually make an incursion or even an invasion of the United States and will burn the town of Columbus, New Mexico, seen on this slide, to the ground. And in these attacks, both in Mexico and on U.S. soil, several Americans were killed, and there was a desire to capture Villa for these attacks, these crimes against American citizens. This operation, called the Punitive Expedition, was led by General John Pershing, or Black Jack Pershing as he was known, and he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. And actually, Villa and Pershing had been friends, because again, Villa had originally been a U.S. ally. When General Pershing's family were tragically killed in a house fire, Villa actually sent Pershing a letter of condolences for his loss. But by this point, they are enemies, and Pershing is going to invade or make an incursion of his own into Mexico with about 10,000 troops. Really a large army, but they don't capture Villa. They make skirmishes with Mexican partisans that are aligned with Villa, but they don't actually capture their primary objective. U.S. troops, though, do get some early combat experience, particularly with new technologies like aircraft and armored cars that will prove useful when the U.S. does enter World War I in the spring of 1917. We'll talk more about Mexico and why the U.S. enters World War I the year they did in a future video. Here are some images related to the Punitive Expedition, armored cars that were used during the period, aircraft used during the period, a piece of operational art illustrating the U.S. operations in northern Mexico. And this is the route taken by General Pershing, and this is the region that was controlled by Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. To sum things up, in many ways, the U.S. has been an empire from its founding, based on classic definitions of empire, and Americans in the past did not see this as a bad thing. Empire was not a dirty word for Americans in the past the way it often is now. It lacked negative connotations. America began to emphasize the construction of its overseas empire, that is, an empire beyond the continental United States, continental North America, in the late 1800s. With purchases of Alaska, other territorial claims like Midway, the annexation of Hawaii, and then the Spanish-American War, which set up America to build a more extensive overseas empire. And the goal is to maintain the balance of power with old empires like the British Empire, and with rising powers like Germany and Japan. And Americans believed that their empire would be more benevolent and more democratic than its rivals. And in some ways, this was true. You can see this with the open door policy, which, while it did give the United States unfettered access to Chinese markets, it did keep the Chinese empire together as a single country. You can see this with granting citizenship to Puerto Ricans. You can see this with the U.S. Occupation of the Philippines was only meant to be temporary, although it did violate the self-determination of the Filipino people. And in many cases, these U.S. interventions and territorial acquisitions were done under the belief that if the United States did not take these regions, other powers would. Perhaps Britain, perhaps Germany, perhaps Japan. Doesn't make it the most moral choice, but from a realist foreign policy perspective, it does become a bit more understandable. And Americans believed that their empire was an empire for liberty, but in many ways the United States made the same mistakes as the powers it claimed to oppose, particularly attitudes towards people of color that informed these military interventions, that informed the belief that these non-white nations could not stand on their own. And there were often self-serving motives cloaked in altruism in these interventions. The U.S. would intervene in countries in Latin America allegedly to restore order, but in many cases they were doing so to protect American business interests. We will continue talking about American foreign policy in our next video on America and the First World War. And many of the same beliefs that inspired American foreign policy in the late 1800s and early 1900s and the growth of the American overseas empire will impact the United States' decision to get involved in World War I.